Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first sign that something was wrong appeared as a shape on the road. It was early March, when the high desert still held the cold of winter through the night, and the sun rose pale and reluctant over the basin. A county road crew traveling west toward the state line noticed a cluster of abandoned vehicles pulled into the gravel turnout near mile marker 117. The cars were parked with uneven care, some doors open, others still locked, all of them coated in a fine layer of dust that suggested they had been there longer than a single night. No footprints marked the sand around them, no note explained their presence. The engines were cold. The turnout sat across from nothing in particular. No homes, no businesses. Only open land stretching toward a low range of rust-colored hills, and, farther out, a dry wash that cut through the plain like a scar. The road crew reported the vehicles and continued on. By the time a deputy arrived hours later, the wind had picked up, dragging thin veils of sand across the asphalt and erasing what little trace might have remained. Within a day, the number of cars was confirmed as 12. All were registered to addresses scattered across 3 states. Several belonged to married couples. 2 were registered to the same post office box in a small mountain town, nearly 200 miles away. 1 had been rented from a regional airport. None had been reported stolen. None contained luggage beyond what could be carried by hand. What tied them together was not yet clear. The desert around the turnout gave nothing back to those who searched it. The ground was too hard for clean impressions, too loose for reliable tracking. The wash showed no disturbance. The nearest structure sat almost 15 miles away. A decommissioned rest stop closed since the late 1990s. Beyond that, there was nothing until the outskirts of Red Haven, a town of fewer than 3,000 residents tucked against the foothills to the north. Red Haven had grown around copper and collapsed when the mine closed. What remained was a place that survived on passing traffic, seasonal construction work, and a handful of small agricultural leases that fought the climate with stubborn persistence. People here were accustomed to minding their own business. Outsiders passed through, but rarely stayed. The sheriff's office began with the simplest explanation. A coordinated meeting, a caravan that had continued on foot, a group of hikers who had misjudged the distance. Yet none of the vehicles contained maps or outdoor gear. Cell phone records showed that most of the owners' devices had gone dark within a few minutes of one another, their last signals clustered near the turnout. The phones were not recovered in the cars. By the second day, missing persons reports began to surface. A woman from Flagstaff who had left home to attend what she described as a spiritual retreat. A retired electrician from Idaho whose children said he had sold his house weeks earlier and cut off contact. A young couple from southern Utah who had withdrawn their savings and resigned from their jobs without explanation. None of their families knew one another. All shared the same final destination written in their calendars, a place identified only as the Gathering. The term meant nothing to local authorities. It did not correspond to any known event permits, religious organizations, or registered assemblies. There was no record of a gathering filed with the county, the state, or any federal agency. Online searches returned only vague references buried in forums devoted to alternative belief systems, threads filled with cryptic language about renewal, separation, and the narrowing of the world. The tension shifted toward the land south of the turnout. Satellite imagery showed an irregular compound approximately 8 miles from the road, reachable only by an unmarked dirt track that branched off the highway and vanished into the scrub. The structure did not appear on any recent zoning maps. It consisted of a central rectangular building, several smaller outbuildings, and a ring of makeshift fencing that followed no clear boundary. The roofs were a patchwork of metal and canvas. The walls appeared unfinished. Property records identified the land as privately owned, purchased 6 years earlier by a limited liability company registered in another state. The company had no other holdings, no employees, and no business activity beyond the acquisition of the parcel. Its registered agent had resigned 2 years earlier. No forwarding address was listed. When deputies reached the compound, they found it empty. The gates stood open. No locks had been cut. Inside, the ground showed signs of recent activity. Foot traffic had worn paths between buildings. A communal hall contained rows of low benches, fashioned from raw lumber. The air smelled faintly of smoke and oil. In the sleeping quarters, thin mattresses lay rolled against the walls. Most personal items were gone. What remained suggested preparation rather than abandonment. Food stores were depleted. Water tanks were nearly empty. A generator sat silent, its fuel line disconnected. In one of the smaller structures, investigators found stacks of handwritten notebooks, their pages filled with dense, careful script. The entries documented daily routines, dietary restrictions, periods of silence, and schedules that aligned bodies and labor with cycles of light and darkness. No author names appeared in the notebooks. Each entry was signed with the same symbol, a simple circle intersected by a vertical line. The symbol appeared elsewhere across the compound. It was carved into door frames, painted onto stones arranged in deliberate patterns, etched into metal plates mounted near the entrances. The repetition suggested more than decoration. It functioned as a mark of belonging. In the largest building, which appeared to serve as a sanctuary, the symbol dominated the far wall, painted in black against bare wood. Beneath it stood a raised platform. No lectern, no chairs, only the platform, worn smooth by use. There were no bodies. This absence unsettled investigators more than any sign of violence would have. The site showed no evidence of struggle, no blood, no broken fixtures. Whatever had occurred here had unfolded with order and consent, or at least without visible resistance. Neighbors were difficult to identify. The nearest ranch sat over 10 miles away. Its owner reported occasional sightings of people walking along the road in single file during early mornings, their heads shaved or closely cropped, their clothing uniform in color and cut. He had assumed they were part of a religious community and thought little of it. Others in Red Haven recalled similar observations. A bus spotted once at a gas station, a group purchasing bulk supplies, a quiet presence that never lingered. They had kept to themselves. By the end of the week, the case had drawn state attention. The number of confirmed missing individuals rose to 19. Federal agencies were notified, but had little to contribute beyond logistical support. No warrants had been issued against the property owners. No criminal activity had yet been established. Still, the pattern was unmistakable. People had arrived at the edge of the desert, left behind their means of return, and followed something or someone into isolation. What that something was remained undefined. As investigators cataloged the compound and traced the paper trail backward, a single fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every known missing person had altered their life in the months before arriving. Assets sold, relationships severed, medical care discontinued. It was as if each had been preparing for an ending that required nothing to be brought along. The desert offered no answers. It absorbed sound and evidence with equal indifference. Whatever had taken place beyond the turnout had already moved on, leaving behind only the outlines of belief and the unsettling quiet of a place that had served its purpose and no longer needed to exist. The investigation expanded outward in careful, methodical rings. State analysts reconstructed the timeline using financial records, cell data, and travel logs, building a map of convergence that pointed unambiguously toward Red Haven and the weeks preceding the gathering. The missing had not arrived together. They came in waves, separated by days or even months, often staying briefly in nearby towns before disappearing into the desert. Receipts placed some in Red Haven itself, eating at the same diner, purchasing the same supplies, withdrawing similar amounts of cash. None appeared to be coerced. What unsettled investigators was the uniformity of preparation. Bank accounts were closed or reduced to minimal balances. Vehicles were serviced shortly before the final drive. Wills were updated. In several cases, beneficiaries were changed to charities with obscure names or to no one at all. It suggested forethought, but not panic. Whatever promise had drawn them had done so slowly, patiently, with room for doubt to be eroded over time. The notebooks recovered from the compound became central to the inquiry. They were written in multiple hands, yet the language remained consistent. The tone was restrained, instructional, and emotionally neutral. There were no sermons, no rants, no apocalyptic warnings. Instead, the pages emphasized alignment, shedding excess, and preparing the body for clarity. The outside world was described not as evil, but as dense, crowded, and increasingly incompatible with the work being done. The work was never clearly defined. Repeated references appeared to a figure identified only as the conductor. No personal details were given. The conductor did not speak in the notebooks. Instructions were attributed to observation rather than command. The conductor demonstrated rather than directed. Participants were encouraged to arrive at understanding independently, guided by structure and repetition. This lack of overt authority complicated the narrative investigators were accustomed to. There was no charismatic leader captured in footage or described with reverence. Those who had encountered the group described its members as quiet, disciplined, and difficult to engage. They did not recruit openly. They waited to be approached. Online, analysts traced the earliest references to the gathering to a closed network of message boards and invitation-only forums. The language there mirrored the notebooks, stripped of emotional appeal and focused instead on process. Prospective participants were not urged to join. They were tested. Questions were answered sparingly. Hesitation was treated as information, not resistance. Digital records showed that some who expressed interest were discouraged from attending. Others were delayed for months. Only a small number were given coordinates and a date. The criteria for selection remained unclear. Search operations in the desert intensified. Grid searches extended from the compound outward, supported by air units and ground teams. Dry washes, ravines, and abandoned structures were examined. Nothing was found. The terrain offered countless places to conceal bodies or camps, yet there were no signs of either. No discarded clothing, no fire pits, no recent disturbances beyond the compound itself. Attention turned back to Red Haven. Investigators began canvassing businesses, reviewing security footage, and re-interviewing residents. Patterns emerged slowly. A particular hardware store had sold repeated quantities of the same items over several years, purchased in cash by different individuals who shared similar appearance and demeanor. A local mechanic recalled servicing vehicles that were never returned for follow-up. A motel clerk remembered guests who stayed only one night, paid in exact change, and left before dawn. One name surfaced repeatedly in records, though never prominently. Thomas Hale appeared as a reference point rather than a participant. His name was listed as an emergency contact on 2 rental agreements tied to missing persons, yet he was not reported missing himself. Property records showed he owned a modest house on the outskirts of Red Haven, purchased shortly after the compound land was acquired. He had no criminal history, no known affiliations, and no steady employment. Tax filing showed minimal income, supplemented by irregular consulting fees from out-of-state entities. When deputies visited his residence, they found it vacant. The house contained furniture, but little else. No personal photos, no mail. The refrigerator was empty. Utilities were active, but usage was minimal. Neighbors described Hale as polite and forgettable. He attended town meetings without speaking. He volunteered occasionally at community cleanups. He did not socialize. Phone records placed him in Red Haven consistently over the past 6 years, with brief trips that aligned with known points of recruitment activity. His device, unlike those of the missing, remained active after the gathering date, pinging towers along the interstate before going dark several days later near a remote stretch of highway far from the desert. There was no evidence that he had returned. This discovery introduced a new tension within the investigative team. Hale could be a facilitator, a caretaker, or merely another follower whose role differed from the others. The notebooks offered no clarity. The conductor was never named. The symbol served as identity enough. Pressure mounted as families demanded answers. Public attention intensified. Media coverage framed the case as a mass disappearance, a cult vanishing into the desert. Authorities resisted the label, wary of drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. Yet privately, the concern deepened. 19 people did not simply disappear without leaving trace. Order did not persist without control. Silence did not maintain itself. A forensic breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. In one of the compound's water tanks, technicians identified trace levels of a sedative compound not used in veterinary or human medicine. It was chemically similar to a substance employed in neurological research decades earlier, one designed to induce deep dissociation while preserving motor function. Its presence did not indicate force, but it suggested facilitation. Someone had engineered compliance at scale. The dosage estimates indicated careful calibration, enough to suppress fear and hesitation without causing harm in the short term. Long-term effects were unknown. The compound was not commercially available. Its synthesis required technical expertise and controlled materials. Investigators returned to the notebooks with renewed urgency. In the later entries, the schedules shifted. Periods of silence lengthened. Meals were reduced. References appeared to the thinning, a stage described as the final alignment before separation. The outside world was no longer mentioned at all. Only the work remained. The final dated entry was written 2 days before the vehicles were abandoned. It described a walk undertaken before dawn, a movement toward open ground, bodies arranged not by instruction but by understanding. There was no fear recorded, no anticipation, only readiness. Where that walk had led and whether it had ended remained unanswered. As search teams prepared to expand beyond the desert basin, one question began to overshadow all others. If the gathering had not ended in death, then where had 19 people gone, and why had the one person who seemed to bridge their world and Red Haven vanished with such precision, leaving behind nothing that could explain what came next? By the third week, the investigation had shifted from search to reconstruction. The absence of physical evidence forced analysts to rely on patterns, negative space, and inference. What had not happened became as important as what had. There were no emergency calls, no abandoned camps, no mass graves uncovered by aerial survey or ground-penetrating radar. The desert, vast and indifferent, had yielded nothing but silence. Attention turned decisively toward movement. Traffic cameras along the interstate corridors surrounding Red Haven were reviewed frame by frame. Analysts tracked every vehicle leaving the region during the 48-hour window following the gathering date. Most were routine, long-haul trucks, commuters, tourists unaware of the scrutiny now applied to their passing silhouettes. but a small cluster stood out. 6 cargo vans, each rented under different names in neighboring states, traveled through the region within hours of one another. They did not move in convoy. Their routes varied slightly, but all converged briefly near Red Haven before dispersing toward different directions. None returned. Rental records showed the vans had been cleaned professionally before return. Mileage logs were incomplete. One van was never recovered. The names used to rent them shared no immediate connection to the missing. However, further analysis revealed that several of the identities belonged to individuals who had died years earlier, their information harvested from public records and obituaries. The method suggested planning rather than opportunism. Investigators returned to the compound yet again. This time, they focused on what had been overlooked. Beneath one of the sleeping structures, they uncovered a concealed storage pit, lined with plastic sheeting. Inside were empty containers, medical tubing, disposable gloves, and chemical residue consistent with the sedative compound found in the water tank. There were also burn marks on the surrounding soil, evidence of controlled disposal rather than haste. Nearby, the dirt track leading away from the compound showed signs of grading. Not recent, but deliberate. Someone had altered the road months earlier to support heavier vehicles. The work was subtle enough to avoid notice, but effective. The walk described in the notebooks was reconsidered in this new context. Investigators traced potential routes outward from the compound that could support a night movement of nearly 20 people without detection. One path led toward a narrow canyon system several miles to the southeast, its entrance obscured by scrub and uneven terrain. Within the canyon, search teams found remnants of temporary lighting and compacted soil that suggested repeated use. There were no personal items left behind. No remains. The canyon opened onto a dry riverbed that paralleled a seldom-used service road. This alignment matched the timing and routes of the cargo vans. The implication was unavoidable. The gathering had not culminated in a terminal act. It had functioned as a transfer point. Why remained unclear. The missing persons profiles were reviewed again, this time with an eye towards skills rather than beliefs. A pattern emerged that had been previously obscured by the focus on ideology. Several had backgrounds in healthcare, engineering, logistics, or education. None were high profile. None irreplaceable in the conventional sense. Together, they formed a cross-section of practical competence. They were not chosen at random. The conductor, still unnamed and unseen, began to feel less like a spiritual guide and more like an architect. The notebooks, once read as devotional, now resembled training manuals stripped of overt purpose. Silence as discipline, hunger as compliance, repetition as identity erosion. Thomas Hale's role grew more troubling in retrospect. Financial analysis revealed that his modest consulting income originated from shell entities linked to offshore accounts. The transactions were small but consistent, enough to sustain his lifestyle without drawing attention. Travel records placed him near other remote communities in the years before the compound was built, locations later associated with similarly structured but smaller-scale disappearances that had never been formally connected. Each instance involved fewer people. Each lacked a visible leader. Each ended without resolution. The pattern suggested iteration. As pressure mounted, federal agencies expanded the scope quietly, wary of public alarm. Analysts searched for signs of similar compounds elsewhere. Satellite imagery revealed several candidate sites across arid regions of the Southwest, all sharing irregular construction, minimal access roads, and a lack of official permits. Most appeared inactive. One showed signs of recent habitation. Before a warrant could be secured, that site went dark. Publicly, authorities maintained restraint. Privately, the concern shifted from loss of life to something more destabilizing. If the missing were alive, then they were being held or moved under conditions designed to erase autonomy. If they were being prepared for work, then the work itself remained unidentified. No ransom demands arrived. No ideological statements were released. No manifesto surfaced online. The silence was complete. The final development of the third week came not from the desert, but from a routine highway stop hundreds of miles away. A state trooper pulled over a delivery truck for a minor violation. The driver's paperwork was in order. The cargo was listed as agricultural equipment. Inside the trailer, secured behind false panels, were modular sleeping units, medical restraints, and sealed crates bearing the same symbol found at the compound. The driver claimed ignorance and was released pending further investigation. The truck had already been cleared at multiple checkpoints. By the time a task force convened to reassess the case, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The gathering had not been an ending. It had been a threshold. Where it led, and whether the missing had crossed it willingly all the way through, remained unanswered as investigators prepared to follow the trail beyond the desert and into a network that appeared designed not to be believed in, but to be obeyed. The break in the case did not come from pursuit, it came from accounting. A federal auditor assigned to the expanding task force identified a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight, obscured by the modest scale of each individual transaction. Over 12 years, a web of non-profit research foundations had quietly moved money through universities, defunct laboratories, and shell consultancies. None of the transfers were illegal on their face. Each supported work framed as cognitive resilience, human adaptation, or long-duration isolation studies. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a supply chain. The sedative compound found at the desert compound had been synthesized legally, in fragments, across multiple research grants that never reported final outcomes. Equipment purchases aligned with those grants mirrored the materials found in the cargo truck. Modular sleeping units were listed as disaster response assets. Medical restraints were categorized as transport safety devices. The work had been funded without ever being named. Thomas Hale emerged clearly at last, not as the conductor, but as its most reliable instrument. His role was logistical, not spiritual. He identified suitable locations, managed local compliance, and ensured that communities remained uncurious. He never recruited directly. He facilitated environments in which people arrived already prepared to consent. The conductor was not a person. Investigators concluded this only after failing to locate any individual who consistently occupied that role across sites. The conductor existed as a process, a framework, a method of belief construction that removed the need for charisma by replacing it with structure. Authority was diffused through routine. Control was achieved through predictability. Obedience was internalized long before physical movement occurred. Those who attended the gathering were not taken to a single destination. They were divided. Using the canyon route and cargo vans, the 19 were dispersed across 4 sites within 48 hours. Each site corresponded to a dormant or semi-abandoned research facility in remote regions, places once used for military testing or environmental monitoring. These facilities had been quietly reactivated under private contracts that avoided public oversight. At those sites, the work resumed. Surveillance confirmed habitation. Thermal imaging showed regular movement. Supply deliveries arrived on predictable schedules. No communications were sent outward. No one attempted escape. The missing were alive. What they were doing was not fully known, but recovered documentation clarified the intent. The project sought to test whether belief could be engineered to the point where identity dissolution became stable. The goal was not loyalty, but reliability. Subjects who no longer perceived separation between instruction and desire required no restraint. The desert compound had been a filter. Only those who adapted completely were moved forward. Others, those who hesitated or resisted quietly, had been turned away long before the gathering. No force was required because selection eliminated the need for it. When warrants were finally executed, the facilities were already in the process of shutdown. Data servers had been wiped. Supervisory staff were gone. What remained were subjects in various stages of cognitive dependency, incapable of articulating where they were or why. Thomas Hale was never found. His phone last activated near a coastal port months earlier. From there, the trail dissolved into international shipping records and false identities too numerous to unwind fully. No evidence placed him in direct control of the project. He had functioned as intended, visible enough to operate, insignificant enough to abandon. Publicly, the case concluded as a recovery operation involving unlawful human experimentation. Charges were filed against shell organizations. Settlements were reached quietly. Details were sealed to protect ongoing investigations that never fully materialized. Privately, investigators acknowledged the truth they could not document completely. The gathering was not an anomaly. It was a successful trial. The desert compound outside Red Haven was dismantled within weeks. The land was returned to private ownership under a different name. Wind erased the last tracks. The road crew continued past mile marker 117 without incident. Nothing marked the place where 19 people had stepped out of their lives together, not to disappear, but to be repurposed. Now let's get into the next story for tonight. The town of Briar Hollow sat low against the river, a place built on gentle grades and unhurried routines. At dawn, fog gathered along the water and drifted through the streets like a thin breath, blurring the outlines of porches and mailboxes. The morning of the death arrived without ceremony. There were no sirens at first, no neighbors stepping onto stoops. The light came in pale through the east, touching the sides of houses and the tops of sycamores. Inside one of those houses, a kitchen clock continued to count seconds with mechanical patience. The house belonged to Daniel and Laura Whitaker. It was a modest split level on Ashbury Lane, painted a neutral gray that had been chosen from a hardware store palette years earlier. The lawn was trimmed but not manicured. A bird feeder hung empty from a shepherd's hook near the driveway. The interior smelled faintly of coffee grounds and lemon cleaner. Daniel lay on the kitchen floor near the sink. His body turned slightly toward the cabinets, one arm bent beneath him, as if caught in a moment of reaching. Laura stood by the counter when the first officer arrived. She had changed her clothes. Her hair was pulled back and still damp. The front door was open, letting in the cool air from the yard. She appeared calm in a way that would later be described as composed, rather than numb. Her eyes were red but dry. She had already called emergency services and followed instructions with careful attention. When asked where her husband was, she had directed them down the short hallway without hesitation. The cause of death was not immediately clear. There was no blood pooling on the tile, no obvious wound visible from the doorway. Daniel's face was slack, his mouth slightly open. A glass lay shattered near the trash can, its contents soaked into the rug. A bottle of prescription pain medication sat on the counter, cap off, pills counted out in a neat line. The arrangement suggested intention or routine, depending on how one looked at it. Briar Hollow police were accustomed to domestic disturbances and the occasional overdose. Homicide was rare enough to feel like a rumor rather than a category. The responding officer secured the house and waited for the county investigator. Laura was guided to the living room and offered a blanket. She declined. She asked once about the family dog, which had been taken by a neighbor earlier that morning. She did not ask about Daniel. The Whitakers had been married for 11 years. Daniel worked as a project manager for a regional construction firm, a job that took him out of town 2 or 3 days a week. Laura managed accounts for a medical supply distributor, working mostly from home. They had no children. Their neighbors described them as quiet and polite, the kind of couple that waved from the driveway and hosted a summer cookout once a year. No one reported hearing arguments through the walls. No police calls had been made to the address. By mid-morning, the kitchen had become a controlled space of evidence markers and gloved hands. The county investigator, Thomas Rourke, moved slowly, taking in the details without comment. He noted the position of the body, the placement of the pills, the broken glass. He asked for the 911 recording and reviewed it in the living room while technicians worked. Laura's voice on the call was steady, providing address and description without interruption. She reported finding her husband on the floor and being unable to wake him. She did not speculate. Rourke had learned to be cautious of scenes that appeared orderly. The absence of chaos could mean careful planning or simply shock expressed through restraint. He observed that the medication bottle belonged to Laura, prescribed after a minor surgery months earlier. The pills were a low-dose opioid, not typically fatal on their own. Toxicology would be needed. He also observed faint discoloration along Daniel's neck, subtle enough to be missed without deliberate inspection. It could have been post-mortem pooling. It could have been something else. Laura answered questions in the dining room. She recounted the morning as routine. Daniel had returned late the night before from a job site in another county. They had eaten separately. She had gone to bed early. She said she woke to the sound of something breaking and found him on the floor minutes later. She did not recall touching the pills. She did not recall hearing him speak. Her answers were consistent across repetitions, the details fixed in place. As the hours passed, word spread through Briar Hollow. A police car parked on Ashbury Lane was enough to draw attention. Neighbors gathered at the corner and exchanged fragments of information. Some recalled seeing Daniel's car pull in after midnight. Others mentioned that the Whitakers had recently listed the house for sale, though the sign had not yet gone up. Speculation moved faster than facts, filling the spaces left by official silence. At the station, Rourke reviewed the Whitakers' records. There were no prior incidents, no restraining orders, no financial red flags apparent at a glance. Bank statements would come later. He requested phone records and emails, a standard measure that often led nowhere. He also requested a full autopsy, noting the neck discoloration and the incongruity between the pills and the apparent calm of the scene. Laura was not detained. She was allowed to leave with a friend and returned later to collect personal items under supervision. She moved through the house with efficiency, choosing a coat, a laptop, a framed photograph from the hallway. She did not linger in the kitchen. When asked if there was anything else she needed, she said no. The autopsy was scheduled for the following day. In the interim, the case existed in an uncertain space between accident and intent. Rourke documented his impressions carefully, avoiding conclusions. He had seen cases hinge on a single overlooked detail, a mark dismissed too quickly, or a timeline accepted without challenge. The pills would be tested. The glass would be analyzed for fingerprints and residue. The neck would be examined with greater scrutiny. That evening, as the fog returned to the river and the town settled into its routines, the Whitaker house remained dark. The front door was closed, the driveway empty. Inside, the kitchen had been cleaned of obvious signs of disruption, but the clock still ticked. The second hand moved in steady arcs, indifferent to the questions that now circled the quiet street. The death had introduced a rupture into Briar Hollow, subtle but unmistakable, and the investigation had only begun to press against its edges. The autopsy took place in a low concrete building on the edge of the county complex, a structure designed for function rather than comfort. Fluorescent lights cast an even glow across stainless steel surfaces. The medical examiner worked methodically, documenting each finding with a practiced neutrality that allowed no room for assumption. Daniel Whitaker's death was officially unexplained until proven otherwise, a designation that kept the investigation open and unanchored. Initial results complicated the apparent simplicity of the scene. The concentration of opioids in Daniel's system was elevated but not lethal. Alcohol was present in a modest amount, consistent with a drink or two late in the evening. There were no signs of chronic abuse. More notable were the marks along the neck. Under magnification, they appeared as faint bruising beneath the skin, irregular and inconsistent with accidental pressure. The hyoid bone was intact. There was no crushing injury. The findings suggested manual compression applied with restraint rather than force. The cause of death was amended to asphyxia of undetermined manner, pending further investigation. For Thomas Rourke, the phrasing mattered. It placed intent back on the table without declaring it. He requested photographs and measurements, then sat alone with the report, tracing the implications forward. If Daniel had been suffocated, it had been done quietly. There were no signs of a struggle in the kitchen, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds. Whatever had happened had ended without chaos. Rourke returned to Ashbury Lane with fresh attention. The house had been released, but evidence tapes still marked the kitchen doorway. He walked through again, slower this time, imagining movement rather than static positions. The sink faced a small window over the yard. A person standing there would have their back to the room. The pills on the counter were aligned with care, more careful than most people would bother with in the early hours. The broken glass suggested interruption. Something had caused Daniel to turn or stumble. The bedroom offered fewer answers. The bed was made with hotel neatness. Laura's side held a single pillow, Daniel's too. A faint indentation remained on one, indicating recent use. The bathroom showed signs of a shower taken not long before the police arrived. Damp towels hung evenly over the rack. The trash held a discarded paper cup. Unremarkable, until Rourke noted a trace of white residue at the bottom. It was sent to the lab. Digital records began to arrive in fragments. Phone logs showed routine communication, mostly work-related. There were no frantic messages, no abrupt breaks in contact. Laura had called Daniel twice the previous evening while he was driving home. Both calls were brief. His phone registered no activity after midnight. Laura's phone showed a period of inactivity between 11:40 p.m. and 6:12 a.m., consistent with sleep. Consistent did not mean conclusive. Financial records revealed subtle tension. The Whitakers' accounts were stable but tight. A recent appraisal suggested the house was worth less than expected. Daniel's company had lost a bid that would have secured his position for another year. Laura's employer had announced restructuring. None of it amounted to crisis, but the margins were narrow. Rourke noted a recent increase in Laura's life insurance policy on Daniel, adjusted upward 3 months earlier. The change was explained as a standard review. It was also flagged for follow-up. Neighbors were interviewed again, this time with more focused questions. One reported hearing a thump sometime after midnight, a sound dismissed at the time as a dropped object. Another mentioned seeing Laura's car lights turn on briefly around 1 in the morning, then off again. The observation was uncertain, filtered through the unreliability of memory sharpened by hindsight. Still, it was recorded. Rourke spoke with Laura at the station 2 days after the autopsy. She arrived on time and alone. Her demeanor had shifted slightly from the morning of the death. The composure remained, but fatigue had set in around the edges. She answered questions without resistance, offering details when prompted. She acknowledged the insurance adjustment and the decision to sell the house. She described the marriage as strained but functional. Long hours, different schedules, no violence, no threats. When asked about the pills, she reiterated that they were hers, and that she sometimes set them out to remember to take them. She denied giving them to Daniel. She denied touching his neck. She denied any physical altercation. Her account remained steady, though Rourke noted a tendency to answer before questions were fully formed, as if anticipating the line of inquiry. It could have been anxiety. It could have been rehearsal. Laboratory results added texture without clarity. The residue in the paper cup was identified as crushed opioid mixed with water. The amount was small, not enough to sedate fully, but enough to dull sensation. Fingerprints on the cup matched Laura. Daniel's prints were absent. The broken glass bore both sets of prints, layered in a way that suggested Laura had handled it after it broke. She explained that she had picked it up in a moment of shock. The explanation was plausible. Rourke mapped the timeline again. Daniel returns home late. He drinks something, possibly prepared for him. The medication dulls him, but does not incapacitate. An argument could have occurred quietly, words kept low to avoid neighbors. At some point, Daniel is at the sink, distracted or unsteady. Pressure is applied to his neck from behind, controlled and sustained. He collapses. The pills are arranged afterward. The scene is shaped to suggest overdose. The call is made. The problem was proof. There were no witnesses, no confession, no direct physical evidence, tying Laura to the act beyond circumstantial alignment. The bruising indicated human hands, but not whose. The medication suggested intent, but not necessity. Rourke felt the familiar frustration of a case built on inference. He needed something that could not be explained away. He returned once more to the river trail that ran behind the neighborhood. It was a quiet path, used by joggers and dog walkers. Near a bend, he noticed a patch of disturbed soil beneath a stand of trees. It could have been animals. It could have been nothing. A search team was called. Beneath the leaves, they found a pair of latex gloves, balled together and partially buried. The gloves were common, sold in any pharmacy. Inside, faint traces of skin cells were present. The gloves were sent for analysis. The wait that followed stretched thin. Briar Hollow watched and waited, the story settling into conversations and glances. Laura returned to work part-time. She was seen walking the dog again. She kept her head down. The house remained listed but unoccupied. When the DNA results came back, they did not bring immediate resolution. The primary profile belonged to Laura. Secondary traces were inconclusive. The gloves alone were not enough. They placed her on the trail, something she could easily explain. She often walked there. Many people did. Rourke prepared his report for the district attorney, careful in his language. He outlined the findings, the inconsistencies, the likely sequence of events. He acknowledged the gaps. The decision would not be his alone. As the file grew thicker, the case pressed toward a threshold, one that required either a decisive push or a retreat into uncertainty. The truth was close enough to feel, but still just beyond reach. The district attorney's office reviewed the file with measured skepticism. The narrative Rourke presented was coherent, but coherence was not the same as certainty. Circumstantial cases required pressure points that could withstand challenge, details that aligned without reliance on interpretation. The question was not whether Laura Whitaker could have killed her husband, but whether the state could demonstrate that she did. The difference was narrow and decisive. Rourke was asked to continue quietly, to look for something overlooked rather than something new. He returned to the Whitaker house one last time, this time with permission to examine areas previously deemed peripheral. The garage sat beneath the main living space, half finished and used primarily for storage. It smelled of oil and cardboard. Along one wall stood a metal shelving unit holding paint cans, holiday decorations, and a small locked toolbox. Laura had mentioned the toolbox in passing, describing it as Daniel's. The lock was simple, easily cut with authorization. Inside were tools arranged with care: a hammer, screwdrivers, a utility knife. At the bottom lay a roll of clear plastic wrap, industrial grade, thicker than what was kept in the kitchen. The item was not inherently suspicious, but it caught Rourke's attention. The kitchen had shown no such material. He sent it for testing. Digital analysis advanced in parallel. A forensic review of Laura's laptop revealed a pattern of searches made late at night over several weeks. They were not overtly incriminating, but they circled a theme. Queries about suffocation, about how long it took, about whether certain drugs dulled pain without causing death. The searches were interspersed with work-related activity, buried in routine browsing. The timestamps clustered between midnight and 2 in the morning, hours Laura had described as sleep. When confronted with the search history, Laura attributed it to anxiety. She said she had trouble sleeping and often read about medical topics. She pointed to a long-standing interest in health-related information due to her job. The explanation was reasonable. It also aligned too neatly with the emerging theory. The plastic wrap from the garage tested positive for skin cells matching Daniel. The amount was small, transferred rather than embedded, but it suggested contact. There was no corresponding residue found in the kitchen, which implied removal. Rourke reconstructed the act with greater specificity. The compression marks on Daniel's neck could have been caused by hands, but they could also have been assisted by a flexible material that distributed pressure evenly, something that left little trace once discarded. The gloves from the river trail were revisited. A deeper analysis of the secondary DNA trace yielded a partial profile consistent with Daniel. It was not definitive, but it supported the idea that the gloves had been used during contact with him. The trail's proximity to the house made disposal plausible. Laura's routine walks provided cover. Rourke compiled the new findings and met again with the district attorney. The case had shifted. It was still circumstantial, but the elements now reinforced each other rather than floating independently. The searches suggested premeditation. The plastic wrap suggested method. The gloves suggested concealment. The financial strain and insurance adjustment suggested motive without overstatement. Together, they formed a structure that could be presented. Laura was arrested quietly on a Tuesday morning. There were no cameras, no crowd. She was taken from a friend's house where she had been staying, her belongings already packed. At booking, she appeared smaller, her earlier composure replaced by a controlled stillness. She declined to make a statement beyond confirming her name. The arraignment was brief. Charges were read. Bail was set. Laura's attorney argued that the evidence was speculative, built on inference rather than fact. The judge listened and ruled without comment. The case was bound over for trial. In preparation, Rourke reviewed everything again, aware that defense scrutiny would be relentless. He revisited assumptions, tested alternative explanations. Could Daniel have self-administered the drug? Possibly. Could the neck marks be accidental? Unlikely, but arguable. Could the plastic wrap have been used for storage rather than harm? Yes. Each point had a counter, but none dismantled the whole. What lingered most was Laura's behavior in the immediate aftermath. The arrangement of the pills, the handling of the glass, the shower taken before help arrived. Individually, they were explainable. Collectively, they suggested control in a moment that rarely allowed it. Rourke understood that juries often responded to patterns more than facts, to the sense that something fit or did not. His task was to present the pattern without forcing it. As the trial date approached, Briar Hollow receded from the center of the story. The town returned to itself, the initial shock replaced by routine curiosity. The Whitaker house remained empty, the for sale sign finally planted in the yard. The river fog continued to roll in at dawn, unchanged by the attention it had briefly drawn. For Rourke, the case had reached its narrowest point. The investigation was complete. What remained was the reckoning, the moment when inference would be weighed against doubt. The truth, whatever its final articulation, had already been shaped by the quiet choices made in a kitchen before sunrise. The final account would soon be delivered, stripped of uncertainty, in a room designed for decisions rather than questions. The trial unfolded without spectacle. The courtroom was spare, lit by high windows that admitted a flat morning light. The jury listened as the story was assembled piece by piece, not as a dramatic arc, but as a sequence of decisions and actions that accumulated weight. There were no raised voices. No single moment carried the case. It moved forward through alignment, rather than revelation. The medical examiner testified first. The cause of death was presented plainly. Daniel Whitaker had died from asphyxia caused by sustained compression of the neck. The injuries were subtle, but consistent. The medication in his system was addressed not as the cause, but as a contributing factor, enough to reduce resistance and awareness. The examiner emphasized that the death could not have been accidental and did not align with overdose. Investigators followed. Thomas Rourke outlined the scene as it had been found, careful to distinguish observation from interpretation. Photographs of the kitchen were shown, the pills laid out with order, the broken glass near the trash, the absence of disturbance elsewhere. The faint marks on the neck were enlarged on a screen, clinical and impersonal. The prosecution moved methodically through the supporting evidence. The crushed medication residue in the paper cup, the plastic wrap from the garage with Daniel's skin cells, the latex gloves recovered along the river trail. The partial DNA profiles were explained with precision, their limitations acknowledged. The late-night search history was presented last, contextualized within a timeline that placed Laura awake and active during hours she had described as sleep. The defense challenged each element. They argued that the searches reflected anxiety rather than intent, that the plastic wrap had innocent uses, that the gloves proved nothing more than disposal of household waste. They emphasized the lack of eyewitnesses and the absence of direct physical proof, tying Laura's hands to Daniel's neck. They returned often to the idea that inference had been allowed to substitute for certainty. Laura did not testify. Her presence was constant but restrained, her posture unchanged across days of proceedings. The jury observed her as they were instructed not to, noting her stillness, her lack of visible reaction. It was impossible to know what weight, if any, those observations carried. Closing arguments avoided excess. The prosecution framed the case as one of quiet control rather than rage. They described a marriage under strain, a narrowing financial future, and a solution arrived at gradually rather than impulsively. They walked the jury through the morning again, from the prepared drink to the moment at the sink, from the compression applied with assistance to the arrangement of the scene afterward. They did not claim certainty beyond what the evidence allowed. They argued coherence. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was delivered without delay. Laura Whitaker was found guilty of second-degree murder. The explanation that emerged afterward was simple and contained. Laura had planned the killing over weeks, researching methods that would leave minimal trace. On the night Daniel returned late, she prepared a drink laced with crushed medication, enough to dull him without causing death. When he stood at the sink, she approached from behind, using plastic wrap to distribute pressure and avoid obvious injury. She held it until movement stopped. She cleaned what she could, disposed of the wrap and gloves along the river trail, arranged the pills to suggest overdose, and showered before calling for help. There was no further commentary offered in court. Sentencing followed according to statute. Laura was led out through a side door, her expression unchanged. Briar Hollow absorbed the resolution quietly. The house on Ashbury Lane was eventually sold. The river fog continued to settle each morning, indifferent to the events it had briefly concealed. The case closed not with a lesson or a warning, but with a sequence completed, a set of actions fully accounted for, and a silence restored where uncertainty had once lingered. Now, let's get into the final story for tonight. The town of Willow sat where the desert flattened and widened, a scattering of low buildings pressed against a two-lane highway that carried more dust than traffic. At dusk, the light drained slowly from the sky, turning the horizon the color of old copper. Wind moved without pattern, lifting grit from the shoulders of the road and setting it down again. Nothing in Willow felt temporary, yet nothing felt fully anchored. People passed through, rarely staying long, and those who remained learned to keep their lives narrow and visible. On a Tuesday in late October, the day cooled earlier than expected. The sun slipped behind the low hills before 5, leaving the town under a pale violet sky. The elementary school emptied, the grocery locked its doors, and the gas station lights flicked on with a faint electrical hum. Beyond the last buildings, the desert began immediately, without trees or fences, a wide open expanse that seemed to absorb sound and distance alike. Emily Carter left the school parking lot at 4:38. She taught 3rd grade, lived alone in a rented duplex near the edge of town, and followed the same routine most afternoons. She drove east for 3 blocks, turned onto Juniper Road, and reached her place within minutes. The route was so familiar it barely registered as movement. That evening, she planned to grade spelling tests and call her sister before dinner. Emily never arrived home. Her car was found just after midnight, angled awkwardly off the road a mile outside town. The driver's door stood open, its interior light draining the battery. The engine was cold. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no sign of impact. The keys were missing. So was Emily. The first person to notice something wrong was the night clerk at the gas station. He recognized Emily's car, a dull gray sedan that came through twice a week for fuel. When he closed at 11, he passed it on the highway shoulder. Lights off, door ajar. He assumed a breakdown and thought little of it, until the car was still there, when the sheriff arrived an hour later. By morning, the road was blocked with yellow tape that fluttered uselessly in the wind. Willow woke slowly, as it always did, but the mood shifted once people understood why patrol trucks lined the highway. News traveled without effort. By noon, everyone knew Emily Carter had vanished somewhere between the school and her front door. The initial assumption leaned toward a voluntary disappearance. Adults did not simply vanish from Willow, but they did leave. People grew tired of the desert, the isolation, the sameness of days. Yet the open car unsettled even the most skeptical. Emily was methodical, careful, known for planning weeks ahead. She did not abandon her vehicle on a cold roadside without reason. Deputies walked the area in widening circles, scanning the dirt for footprints, tire impressions, anything that broke the surface of the sand. The ground was uncooperative. Wind erased detail quickly, smoothing the desert like water over stone. What little remained suggested more than one set of tire tracks, some overlapping, some too faint to follow. Inside the car, everything appeared ordinary. Her bag lay on the passenger seat, still zipped. Papers sat neatly in the console. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no scattered belongings. The absence itself felt deliberate, as if whatever had happened occurred quickly and cleanly. By afternoon, state investigators arrived, drawn by the emptiness of the scene rather than its chaos. They noted the location carefully. The stretch of highway was dark at night, unlit, and rarely traveled after sunset. Cell service faded in and out. Anyone stopping there would be isolated, unseen by passing traffic for long minutes at a time. Attention turned to Emily's routine. She left school at nearly the same time every day. She drove the same roads. She stopped occasionally at the gas station or the post office, rarely anywhere else. Predictability settled over her life like a pattern worn into the ground. Friends and coworkers described her as cautious, private, and steady. She did not date much. She kept her circle small. No recent conflicts surfaced. No debts, no sudden changes, no known threats. The absence of motive frustrated investigators, but it also sharpened their focus. Crimes without obvious cause often relied on opportunity. Search teams moved outward into the desert, tracing dry washes and shallow ravines where sound and sight disappeared. Helicopters skimmed low over the land, their shadows sliding across scrub and stone. Nothing appeared. No clothing, no disturbed earth, no indication that Emily had gone willingly or otherwise into the open desert. As daylight faded again, a different pattern emerged. Traffic cameras from neighboring counties showed a dark pickup traveling west through Willow shortly after 5. The vehicle did not belong to any local resident. Its plates were obscured by dust, but its timing aligned with Emily's disappearance. The truck did not stop in town. It slowed near Juniper Road, then accelerated toward the highway. Investigators returned to the car with renewed attention. They measured distances, angles, and lines of sight. From the driver's seat, the road curved gently, limiting visibility ahead. If another vehicle had stopped suddenly or appeared from a side road, Emily would have had little warning. The open door suggested she exited the car willingly, at least initially. That night, Willow felt smaller than it ever had. Porch lights stayed on. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Parents kept children indoors. The desert pressed close to the edges of town, silent and watchful. Somewhere beyond the reach of the streetlights, answers waited. But the first day ended without them, leaving only a cold car on the roadside and the growing certainty that Emily Carter had not simply walked away. By the second morning, the certainty hardened into routine. Command posts were set up along the highway, folding tables weighted down with maps and coffee thermoses. Search grids were redrawn and reassigned. Deputies rotated through 12-hour shifts, their patrol trucks coated in dust that never fully washed off. The investigation shifted from reaction to structure, from shock to method. The state team began by reconstructing Emily Carter's final hour. Security footage from the school showed her leaving on time, alone, carrying a canvas tote heavy with papers. A traffic camera near the courthouse caught her sedan heading east minutes later. After that, there was nothing until the abandoned car. The space between those points became the focus, a narrow corridor of time and road where something precise and decisive had occurred. Investigators drove the route repeatedly, at different speeds at different times of day. They noted where headlights disappeared into dips in the road, where shoulder space widened enough for a vehicle to pull alongside another. Juniper Road intersected the highway at a shallow angle, poorly lit and rarely used after dark. Tire impressions near that junction were faint but inconsistent, as if a heavier vehicle had slowed, adjusted, then moved on. The pickup truck seen on the camera footage became the central thread. Analysts enhanced the images frame by frame, isolating its shape and modifications. It was older, with a raised suspension and a toolbox mounted behind the cab. A distinctive dent marked the rear panel, subtle but consistent across multiple frames. The truck passed through Willow once and never returned, which suggested intention rather than coincidence. Lists were generated. Local owners of similar trucks were interviewed and cleared. Mechanics were asked about recent repairs matching the damage. Nothing connected. The truck was not registered in the county or any neighboring jurisdiction. It had come from farther away, passing through Willow as a means, not a destination. Attention turned to Emily herself. Her phone records showed no unusual calls or messages. Her email contained lesson plans and routine correspondence. There were no dating profiles, no online arguments, no evidence of someone tracking her digitally. Yet her predictability remained undeniable. She left work at the same time. She drove alone. She traveled a stretch of road where help was distant, and darkness arrived early. Search teams expanded beyond the immediate desert. Dry culverts beneath the highway were checked. Abandoned sheds and line shacks used by ranchers were entered and cleared. The land offered many places to hide something temporarily, fewer places to hide something permanently. Still, nothing surfaced. By the third day, tips began arriving from outside Willow. Truck drivers reported seeing a gray sedan stopped along the highway that evening, hazard lights flashing briefly before going dark. One recalled a pickup pulled in front of it, angled as if offering assistance. Another remembered headlights off in the distance, parked too cleanly to be broken down. Each account added shape but not certainty. Investigators debated whether Emily had been targeted specifically or encountered someone by chance. The lack of violence at the scene suggested control rather than panic. There were no signs she had been forced from the car. The keys missing implied movement afterward, not abandonment. If she left the vehicle voluntarily, it was likely under the belief that she would return quickly. The possibility of impersonation was raised quietly. In rural areas, authority carried weight. A uniform, a light bar, even the suggestion of official business could compel compliance. No confirmed reports of false stops had been made in the region, but absence did not equate to safety. On the fourth evening, a break came from an unexpected direction. A wildlife camera placed near a ranch gate 20 miles west of Willow captured a pickup matching the suspect vehicle just after 6 on the night Emily vanished. The image was grainy but clear enough to show the toolbox and the rear panel dent. In the bed of the truck, partially obscured by shadow, was a pale shape that did not shift between frames. The road near the camera led toward a network of abandoned mining claims, land that changed hands decades ago and was rarely visited now. The area was a maze of dirt tracks, some leading nowhere, others looping back into the desert. It was a place where maps lost precision and landmarks repeated themselves. Search teams moved in before dawn. They followed tire tracks that faded and reappeared, sometimes doubling back, sometimes vanishing into hard-packed earth. Several sites showed recent disturbance, shallow scrapes where a vehicle had turned sharply or stopped briefly. One location contained a discarded length of nylon rope, cut cleanly at one end. It was not weathered. It had not been there long. For the first time, the investigation shifted tone. What had been treated as a disappearance began to align with abduction. The care taken at the roadside now felt intentional rather than fortunate. Whoever took Emily had planned enough to leave little behind and to move her far from the place she vanished. As night fell again over Willow, the search pushed deeper into the desert. The land offered no answers yet, only distance and silence. But the shape of the crime was emerging, and with it the sense that time mattered more than ever. The abandoned mining claims lay beyond the reach of routine patrols. A scatter of collapsed structures and shallow shafts carved into the land long before Willow existed. The roads that led there were unmarked and unreliable, thinning into tire ruts that drifted apart and rejoined without warning. Navigation depended less on signage than memory, and memory belonged to those who had reasons to return. Search teams moved carefully, aware that the ground itself posed hazards. Old shafts were sometimes covered with little more than rotting boards and sand. The desert concealed its dangers quietly. Each step was deliberate, each sweep of a flashlight measured. Progress was slow, but the terrain demanded it. Near one of the claims, a low structure emerged from the darkness. It had once been a storage shed, its roof partially collapsed, its door hanging open on rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. The floor bore fresh tire marks, compressed earth that had not yet loosened under the wind. Investigators noted the width and tread pattern, consistent with a lifted pickup. There was no sign of a struggle, no personal items, nothing to suggest prolonged occupancy. It felt like a stopping point rather than a destination. Farther along the track, they found evidence of planning. A cluster of footprints showed repeated movement between a vehicle and the edge of a dry wash. Drag marks scored the dirt briefly, then vanished where the ground hardened. The impression suggested weight and resistance, but not chaos. Whatever had occurred had been managed, controlled, and brief. The nylon rope discovered earlier was tested and traced to a regional hardware chain with stores across 3 states. That detail alone offered little, but it reinforced the sense of forethought. This was not an act driven by sudden impulse. It required preparation, timing, and familiarity with isolation. Investigators expanded their scope beyond the desert. They examined missing persons reports in neighboring states, looking for patterns that echoed Emily Carter's disappearance. 2 cases surfaced that drew immediate attention. Both involved women stopped along rural highways at dusk. Both vehicles were found intact, doors open, keys missing. Neither woman had been recovered. At the time, the cases were treated separately, too distant geographically to be linked. Now, the similarities felt deliberate rather than coincidental. The pickup described in those cases matched the one captured near Willow. Older model, toolbox, rear panel damage. The vehicle had appeared briefly, then disappeared into regions where cameras thinned and records dissolved. It moved along corridors of low visibility, choosing roads that offered privacy rather than speed. As the picture sharpened, so did the urgency. If Emily had been taken by someone who had done this before, she was unlikely to be held nearby. Temporary locations suggested transit, not containment. The desert stops were staging points, places to adjust, to avoid attention, to ensure compliance before moving on. Attention turned to property records tied to the mining claims. Many were defunct, their owners long deceased or unreachable. One parcel, however, stood out. It had changed hands quietly 2 years earlier. Purchased through an intermediary company, registered out of state. The land included a derelict processing building farther west, accessible only by a narrow track that did not appear on most maps. Aerial surveillance confirmed recent activity there. Vehicle tracks converged near the structure, and a generator had been run within the last week. Heat signatures detected residual warmth inside, despite the building's abandoned status. The location was remote, even by desert standards, shielded by low ridges and invisible from the nearest road. Tactical teams approached just before dawn. The building was empty when they entered. Inside, they found restraints bolted into concrete, clean and deliberate. A cot sat against the far wall, its fabric creased but bare. There were no personal belongings, no food, no waste. The space was designed for holding, not living, and not for long. The absence cut sharply. It meant Emily had been there. It also meant she was no longer there. For the first time, investigators confronted the possibility that they were following rather than catching. The offender was mobile, adaptive, and attentive to pressure. Each discovery arrived slightly too late, each location already abandoned. As the sun rose over the desert, casting long shadows across the processing building, the investigation reached a critical juncture. The pattern was clear now, the method unmistakable. What remained unknown was where the road ended, and whether they could reach it in time. The pattern that finally emerged did not point deeper into the desert, but outward, along its edges, where isolation met access. Analysts overlaid the known locations on freight routes, agricultural supply roads, and defunct airstrips left over from decades earlier. The suspect vehicle had avoided population centers, but it did not wander randomly. It followed a logic of movement that balanced privacy with mobility. That logic led investigators north, toward a stretch of land where ranching thinned and properties spread miles apart. One address appeared repeatedly in peripheral records, never central, never alarming. A modest parcel listed under a single owner, Thomas Hale, purchased 5 years earlier. Hale worked seasonally as an equipment transporter, moving machinery between states. His schedule was irregular, his routes flexible, his presence rarely questioned. Vehicle registration tied a pickup, matching the suspect description to Hale. The dent on the rear panel appeared in an insurance claim filed 3 years earlier for minor damage sustained off-road. The claim had been settled without inspection. Surveillance placed the truck on highways corresponding to the earlier disappearances, always passing through, never stopping long enough to be noticed. Investigators moved quickly, but quietly. Aerial observation confirmed activity at Hale's property, despite its appearance of abandonment. A barn behind the main structure showed recent tire tracks. Power usage spiked intermittently, consistent with generator use. The land itself offered cover, shallow gullies and low hills that shielded the buildings from view. When teams entered the property, they found Emily Carter alive inside a reinforced room beneath the barn. She was restrained but conscious, dehydrated and weak. She had been moved repeatedly, held briefly in different locations, each one designed to delay discovery rather than conceal permanently. Hale had relied on distance, timing, and the assumption that investigations fractured across jurisdictions. He was arrested without resistance at a supply stop 40 miles away, returning with fuel and water. In his vehicle were restraints, maps marked with handwritten notes, and a handheld radio tuned to local law enforcement frequencies. The method was clear in retrospect. He staged authority, used isolation to control encounters, and moved quickly before attention could converge. Hale confessed to abducting multiple women over several years, selecting locations where help was distant and compliance seemed safest. 2 of the earlier victims were later located at separate burial sites along remote corridors he had traveled repeatedly. Emily survived because pressure arrived sooner than he anticipated, and because his system, built on precision, left little margin for disruption. The case closed without ceremony. Emily was transported out of Willow under medical supervision, her recovery left to private care beyond the reach of the investigation. Hale was transferred into federal custody, his network of locations dismantled and cataloged. Willow returned to its routines within weeks. The highway remained, the desert remained. At dusk, the light still drained slowly from the sky, and the wind still moved without direction. The difference lay only in what was now understood about the space beyond the town, and how easily silence could be used by someone who knew how to travel through it.